Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, it's the second part of my conversation with Julian Jackson about the extraordinary story of the trial of Marshal Pétain in Paris in 1945. And in today's episode, we turn to what is in many ways the central question of the trial. Was the Vichy regime led by Pétain a collaborationist regime, or did it protect the French people? And if it did protect the French people, why the hell didn't it do more to protect France's Jews? So we have now moved to that part of the trial and also the case against Pétain, which does turn on what happened both under Vichy and then, for people at Aron, the real question, what happened after November 1942. Part of the defence, a big part of the defence, was not simply that Pétain, by remaining in France, by creating a sort of legal entity that could negotiate with the Germans by governing over a part of France, which was in some nominal sense the free zone. Not only in doing that did he provide, as he liked to say, a shield for the French people, but also, this was the phrase that was used, he was able to play a double game. That is, one shouldn't take at face value all of the official acts of the Vichy government, because they were also, in subtle, complicated, maybe quite hard to detect ways, trying to subvert the Nazi regime, or at least what the Nazis were able to do in France. Now, that part of the defence in the trial, and I think maybe in the view of history, doesn't hold up to a huge amount of scrutiny. The defence, Isoni in particular, made quite a lot of it. Do you think there is a case to be made that there was a double game being played? And there are various different versions of it. And I want to ask you about what seems to me the least plausible, but in a way, most dramatic version of it. But more broadly, was Pétain in a position to say that it's more complicated than it seems because I was doing things behind the scenes that actually were of real value to the French people?
So we're now on the question of collaboration and what lay behind it. Was it, as it were, a smoke screen behind which other things were going on? On the question of just collaboration, before we answer that, really one of the pieces of incriminating evidence, if you want, for the prosecution was the famous meeting between Pétain and Hitler in October 1940, where they met at a small railway station in the Loire area of France, a place called Montoire, and they were together for about an hour, but what was really important was the Germans took a photograph of Pétain shaking Hitler's hand and so on. And this was a huge shock to the French population when it was seen, and because, remember, the armistice hadn't put an end to the war. It was simply France had signed an armistice, and the assumption was the assumption of Vichy was that Britain would be defeated, there would be a peace treaty, France would do its best to get the best possible deal. And therefore, France was neutral, technically. And therefore, seeing Pétain shake Hitler's hand was a massive shock to French public opinion. And Pétain, however, made a speech a few days later defending his action and saying that he was entering down his phrase, the road of collaboration, and his justification was that it would be a way of winning concessions for the French under the harsh conditions of the occupation and so on. Now, no one really knew what had happened in that conversation at the time. We now know that it was no more than a sort of a vague set of discussions which committed nobody to anything. After the war, defenders of Vichy invented ever more elaborate defences of what had happened. The idea was, for example, that Pétain had, by sort of reassuring Hitler that the French were genuine about their neutrality, freed Hitler in his mind to turn on the Soviet Union, which is what he'd always wanted to do. And therefore, cleverly, Pétain had contributed to a Baroque explanation. But it was one which had a certain traction. One of the defenders of Pétain, not a lawyer, but somebody who wrote a lot of books in his defence after the war, wrote a book called Montoire. So Montoire was where the meeting happened. Montoire, Verdun diplomatique, diplomatic Verdun. So Montoire was a diplomatic victory for the French. Now, this was, extraordinary, implausible and elaborate. But was there behind Montoire, behind collaboration, a double game? That's to say, at the same time as seeming to hold out a hand to Hitler, was Pétain also, by secret channels, keeping open contacts with the British? The simple answer is no, a complete fantasy. The whole Vichy elite believed that the war was over. That was the reason for the armistice. They believed that once France was out of the war, there was no way the British could win. Their premise was that Britain would be defeated sooner or later, and that was the assumption right until the end of 1942. However, it so happened, and you said there, you asked me about a particular example of the supposed double game. It so happened that on the same day as Montoire, an emissary from Pétain happened to be in London, and he'd arrived a few days before. He was a professor of philosophy at Besançon, who genuinely believed in Pétain, wasn't pro-German in any kind of way, and so he offered his services because he had some contacts in British academic circles, at the LSE in particular. He was a kind of philosopher of liberalism, so he'd been involved in various sort of liberal colloquia before the war and so on. So he said, I know people in Britain. If you like, I'll go over and test the ground and so on. Anyway, he arrives in London and he approaches various people. And then Montoire happens. And of course, the British are shocked and also worried by Montoire. Does it mean the French are actually going to go back into the war as an ally of Germany? So it so happens that this ineffectual Professor Louis Rougier is there in London, so Churchill actually meets him. I think he wouldn't have bothered to meet him, except that here's a Frenchman who claims to be an emissary from Pétain, who might have some explanation for what's really going on. Rougier knew no more than Churchill, and was as amazed by Montoire as anybody else. But he reassured him, Pétain is not in favour of collaborating with Germany and so on. And after the war, Rougier, or during the war, he went to America afterwards, sort of inflated this visit, which did exist. And the problem with these kinds of theories is when there's a kernel of truth, it's always a problem. When there's a kernel of truth, and he was there, and he did meet Churchill. So this became conflated into, even in the most extreme examples, he had signed a secret agreement with Churchill called the Pétain-Churchill Accords. All nonsense. He did go to London. The British were interested in seeing if Vichy could be lured out of its neutrality. So when a potential emissary comes, they want to see what's going on. But the truth was, at every point, in truth, Vichy is staking everything on a German victory. And I don't honestly think we need to go any further into these. There were 2 or 3 other interlocutors who presented themselves, but they represented nobody except themselves and the illusions they probably carried themselves. I don't think Rougier, he was a mixture of a fantasist who then started to believe his own fantasies, and then when people didn't take him seriously, it's the classic conspiracy theorist. You dig yourself deeper and deeper into that hole. But what is interesting is after the war, another defence of the Vichy that was put about by Vichy defenders, and that was put about already at the trial, in its extreme version as Vichy saved Britain. Vichy saved the Allies, in fact. Without Vichy, the Allies might not have won the war. Now, how do you get to that? You get to that by the turning point of the war isn't Stalingrad. The turning point of the war is North Africa. Vichy, by signing an armistice, had kept the German troops out of the southern zone of France, but also kept German troops out of North Africa, out of Morocco, Algeria and Tunisia. So when the Allies launched their landing in Operation Torch in November 1942, there aren't Germans there, and so they are able quickly to take over those territories. Had the Germans been there, the Germans would have fought them off, and that whole attempt to get the underbelly of Europe, the Churchill's phrase, would have failed. So the armistice saved Europe. Now, obviously, if there's any credence in that, it certainly wasn't the intention. It's an unintended consequence. But secondly, what we do know is that Vichy did tell its soldiers in North Africa to fire on the Americans, and about 100 Americans were killed by Vichy defenders, but they didn't have the force of the Germans, and so they're quickly overrun. So in a curious kind of way, that's one of the most acrobatic, I think, defences that Vichy had of the armistice. The armistice, unwittingly, you might say, contributed to the Allied victory. And the problem was that credence was given to that by Churchill himself, who in one of his major moments of irritation against de Gaulle, of which there were many, and he got more and more irritated by de Gaulle as time went on. He once exploded when he was in Algeria in 1944 to General Georges, another general from the fall of France. He said, de Gaulle goes on and on about how he is France and so on. But yes, the armistice did serve the interests of the Allies, and he was meaning that. And of course, at the trial, General Georges was brought in to quote Churchill saying the armistice helped save the Allies. But it's even more implausible in my mind than the double game, which people still want to knock it on the head, the double game. It obviously floats out there. Éric Zemmour, who's the extreme right polemicist in France today, in his defense of Vichy, one of the things he has still brought out is the alleged double game. It's just, unfortunately, there's just enough to give those people who want to see it as happening, there's just enough, because of the visit that happened by Rougier, to give for what you might call conspiratorial defenders enough to go on. But it's a fantasy.
So I want to ask you one more thing about the case for and against in the trial and also in the verdict of history. And then I want to come on to the question that we alluded to earlier, which is the fate of France's Jewish population. But as you just said, part of the difficulty for the defense is that it was absolutely clear that the Vichy regime was convinced the British were going to lose. And that was their position. So they were neutral, waiting for a German victory. But that position became harder and harder to maintain once doubts about a German victory started to rise. But it was particularly hard to maintain once the question had to be asked whether any of the resources, military resources of the Vichy regime, would be used to defend Germany or the German regime, or indeed the German regime as it existed in France. So as you just gave the example of what happened in North Africa when the Allies invaded. And there was also a big controversy at the trial about whether Pétain had or hadn't sent a telegram telling his admiral to allow the fleet to be used on the Ally side. That was part of the evidence for this double game. But again, the evidence seems to evaporate. But also the example you gave right at the beginning of the juror whose diary you have, the real crime is not being neutral and waiting for something to happen, but in any sense participating, the sins of commission, not of omission, allowing French soldiers to fight with the Germans, allowing French weapons to be turned on the Allies. And it does seem to me that in the trial, there were many weaknesses to the defense of Pétain, but that's the biggest of all. He did allow that to happen. When a trial run for D-Day took place, it was the case that forces of the Vichy regime were allowed to repel the invaders.
The defenders of Vichy at the trial and afterwards would say that at no point did the Vichy regime, collaboration never became military collaboration, would be the defense. So Laval, who testified at the trial and was then himself later tried, couldn't deny that he believed that the collaboration was a rational policy that could be justified, but he said that he never supported military collaboration, fighting with the Germans. And obviously, to nail that one, to show that Vichy had either participated in or been willing, even if it didn't happen, to militarily collaborate with the Germans, would have been the absolute nail in the coffin. I mean, that would have nailed treason. And it turned out to be more difficult to nail than, well, one reason it turned out to be difficult to nail was there was a grand absent at the trial, an absentee, and the absentee was Admiral Darlan. Admiral Darlan had been the key figure at Vichy for most of 1941 and part of 42. And Darlan actually went closer down the road of military collaboration with the Germans than Laval had ever done. Because in 1941, when there was a rising against the British in Iraq, the Germans thought this is a good opportunity for us and so wanted to send support to the anti-British movement in Iraq. They asked whether they could have access to French air bases in Syria. Now that, obviously, to say yes to that is the first step towards you may not be fighting yourself, but you're allowing the fighting to take place. Darlan signed up for that and signed up to something called the Protocols of Paris. But in the end, it didn't go the full way. And the problem is Darlan was assassinated in December 1942, so he was never there, as it were, to be pushed on that. So an enormous amount of time was spent discussing one telegram, almost the peak of the roundup of Jews in occupied France in July and August 1942, is mentioned in the trial, but much less than a telegram that was sent from Vichy to the German ambassador in Paris to be passed on to Hitler. And the telegram basically said there had been a dry run for D-Day at Dieppe. The British, the Anglo-Canadians had tried a landing in Dieppe test run, and it had been repulsed very easily by the Germans. And so Pétain sent a telegram to Hitler via the embassy in Paris to congratulate him on having preserve the intactness of French soil or repulse. Now, that in itself is fine. You'd have been involved in any kind of way. But he then went on to say, and he would certainly consider in future such situations the possibility, it's all, the terminology was extremely flowery, of the French participating in the defense of their own territory, which is how about French soldiers helping you repulse Allied attacks? Huge amount of time was spent. The telegram had been sent, but had Pétain really signed it? Had somebody signed it in his name? Was it ever sent to the Germans, and so on? And more time, hours, were spent discussing this telegram, which did exist, but whose status was, even the postal official who sent it was brought in. Was it Pétain's signature? He said he wasn't sure, etc., etc. Why? Because that really would have been the nail in the coffin of the case that was to be made against, which is treason. In the end, the whole thing was too uncertain in relation to this telegram, but there were other key indicators. We go back to my juror, the one I follow, his thoughts on the trial. He, as I said earlier, felt that the unforgivable was that Pétain should have in any kind of way lent any kind of support to French men fighting with the Germans. However, it wasn't officially the Vichy regime, it was volunteers. So again, it's at one remove, if you want. So we never have an example of a commitment to military collaboration, but we're so close that this juror, for example, was convinced that was a step too far. But just to go back to that key moment, because you're right, it's the key moment, November 1942. After November 1942, Vichy has no cards left to play. It's got no free zone. It's got no fleet. In 1942, the fleet scuttled itself rather than to fall into German hands. So there's no fleet, there's no empire, and there's no free zone. Vichy has nothing, which is why at that point Aron said that's when Pétain should have either gone to North Africa or resigned or whatever. And it has to be said, those last 2 years, or the period January 43 to the end, to August 44, is the toughest for the defence to defend. And the line then becomes slightly different. It still becomes, well, without Pétain, things could have still even then been worse, right? So, okay, the shield is getting a bit leaky, but nonetheless, it's still better than no shield. That's one position. But the other is to turn Pétain into an almost Christ-like sacrificial victim. Pétain, the term was used, the crown of thorns that Pétain wears. So this is the martial martyr who remains with his people through all the trials. There's not much he can do. He could do his best, but he's not going to abandon his people. So at that point, it's no longer really much about the efficacy of the regime, but almost more about the symbolic martyrdom of the Marshal. Because it has to be said, a lot of Pétain's own advisors thought he should have, but they weren't going to say it at the trial because they remained verbally loyalists. But the case for Pétain as a shield becomes a sieve, really, by 1943.
And as you said, in this trial, much more time is spent talking about various telegrams, one in particular, but there are others as well that may or may not have been sent, than the question of the fate of France's Jewish population. So we have to be clear, this is a treason trial. Crimes against humanity, that category had not yet come into existence. This is before Nuremberg. It happened very soon after the end of the war. It's not an international tribunal. This is a French trial of a French citizen charged with treason against the French state. Nonetheless, the question of the fate of France's Jews was raised in the trial, but not much was made of it, and not much was made of it by the prosecution. So there are really two questions here, which is why that choice by the prosecution? Should we be surprised by it? Is it really hindsight that shocks us when we see that so much time is spent on these, what looked like rather niggling matters to do with, was it or wasn't it his signature, when tens, hundreds of thousands of French Jews are being rounded up and sent to their fate? And secondly, is there any evidence at all, that Vichy, particularly before November 1942, but also perhaps after 1942, was able to ameliorate the fate of France's Jewish population in any way?
Well, we could spend 90 minutes on this one because it is a huge question. The thing that really now surprises contemporaries with our contemporary sensibilities is how surprisingly little was said about the Jews at the trial. And I think one's got to remember that the Holocaust really becomes the sort of defining horror of the 20th century only from the 1960s, after the Eichmann trial in particular in 1961 in Jerusalem. In 1945, in France, in the first place, no one is aware, I think, of the specificity of the Holocaust, of the extermination of Jews. What I mean by the specificity is people were very shocked in May 45, that's to say a month or two before the trial of Pétain. Pétain arrives back in April, the trial opens in July, and in May the camps start to open. And so you get the return of deportees with images we're all familiar with of, people seeming more dead than alive in their striped pajamas, all images that we all know. And they shocked public opinion, and they did lead to quite a sharp move in public opinion against Pétain in May, June 1945. But people made no distinction when they saw these ghosts returning from the camps between Jews, though of course most Jews didn't return, but some did, between the Jewish deportees who had returned and the other deportees, resistors, who had been deported. So there's a sense, yes, we feel for the deportees, but we don't distinguish between the Jewish deportees and other deportees. There isn't a sense that something else has gone on. That is simply not part, and it's also the case that at Nuremberg, the issue of the extermination of the Jews was much less central than the big case against the Nazis at Nuremberg was that they were war criminals. They had caused the Second World War. It's not that the Holocaust was not talked about, but it was secondary, and it was even more secondary in France in 1945. First, because simply there is no understanding. Secondly, there is a sort of ambient antisemitism in 1945, not just in France, actually in many European countries, something very hard for people today to realize. But, for example, in May 1945 in France, the owners of properties that had been Jewish, who bought their properties, sometimes probably in good faith, confiscated properties in the war, were suddenly met with returning Jews, the few who did return, wanting to repossess their properties, and they felt very aggrieved. We bought these properties in good. So these owner defense associations claimed that they had been patriots who had bought the properties to keep them out of the hands of the Germans and so on. So there's not a particularly favorable mood towards the Jews. So the first Jewish organization, an organization called the CRIF, the Representative Council of French Jews, Israélite Français, it debated whether it should or not testify at the trial. And they were very reluctant because they were aware of this mood music, which wasn't totally favorable to them. And that ambient anti-Semitism, because people had not, as it were, grasped intellectually or emotionally the horror of the extermination camps, there were still a lot of people who felt, oh, well, the Jews had played a bit too much of an excessive role in France before 1940. The resistance was not free of anti-Semitism. So one of the most extraordinary things is the roundups of Jews are mentioned in the trial. We'll come to that in 1 minute. But I don't think it is mentioned more than a minute in passing, was Vichy's own anti-Semitic laws. One of the first things Vichy did in 1940 was to pass what was called the Jewish Statute, excluding Jews from practicing as doctors, lawyers, teachers, professors, and so on, unless you could get an exemption. That wasn't really an issue for anybody in 1945. It just wasn't seen as a big deal. It wasn't seen as so many other crimes that were greater. So the significance of what had happened isn't central, and that's, I would say, the case in all European countries. Now, nonetheless, everybody knew that, and they separated this from Vichy, that Jews had been arrested in July 1942, and this had been a big moment in the history of the occupation, when for the first time the Catholic Church publicly protested against what was happening. 4 archbishops formally protested against the horrific scenes of Jewish children, women being arrested and so on. So it wasn't that this wasn't known. So what is the defence there? Because that bit is known about. And the defence there is it was the Germans. Of course, people knew that the French police were the people who were doing the arresting, but it was the Germans, and Vichy did its best. It wasn't a Vichy policy, and Vichy did its best to ameliorate or to reduce what was happening, but it couldn't stop it. And the fact that that argument had a certain traction in the trial can be very simply illustrated by another juror. And this was the oldest of the jurors, who was called Georges Alphonse Lévy, and he was one of the parliamentarian jurors, not the resistance jurors. And Alphonse Lévy, obviously Jewish name, he was Jewish, but he was also from Alsace, Alsatian, and he was a venerable Third Republic politician who had not voted full powers to Pétain. When it came to the deliberations of the jury, are we going to vote for the death penalty or not? Are we going to go for the most extreme version? He said, as an Alsacien, I would vote for the death penalty because Pétain did nothing to protest, to stop, to show that he disapproved of the effective annexation of Alsace and Lorraine by the Germans in 1940. This wasn't part of the armistice, they just did it. And he said, as an Alsacien, for me, that as a patriot from this part of France, that is unacceptable. It requires a death penalty. But as a Jew, I would not want to vote the death penalty because I believe that the Marshal did his best to mitigate the effects of the German policy towards the rest of the Jews and so on. So, I mean, the fact that he could say that shows that that argument did have a certain traction. That argument became much more developed after the war into a complicated theory which goes like this, very simply, that the Vichy authorities, the head of police and Laval, did a deal with the Germans. Knowing that the Germans were intending to arrest Jews, they thought, what can we do? They're going to do it anyway. They want our police to be involved. We'll agree to the French police. We will lend the French police to this operation, but only if those who are arrested are non-French Jews, are refugees who'd arrived in the 1930s. So we're protecting the French Jews. And unfortunately, we have no choice. This is going to mean that foreign Jews are sacrificed. That's in a nutshell, the theory. And it is indeed true that the first arrest, that was the deal done. Though, of course, the Germans gave no guarantees about what would happen to French Jews later on. And that argument still has a certain traction. And I think the problem is here, we have to go into counterfactual territory. Again, let's assume that that deal hadn't been signed and that the Vichy had said, no, you're not having our police. Our police are not going to get involved in any way. Do it yourself if you want to do it. What would have happened then? Well, the German police in France were minuscule. The Germans would certainly not have had the information or the resources to carry out roundups as effective as those that were carried out, but they would have instructed the French police, however. Would the French police have been less effective if instructed by the Germans than instructed by Vichy? These are all, endless counterfactuals. And I think in the end, my own view is it is possibly even the case that objectively, if the Vichy regime had not existed, more French Jews might have perished than perished. But however, Vichy had the chance to say no to this operation. It didn't take the chance, and the reason it didn't take the chance to say no, the French police are not going to be involved, wasn't because it cared very much about saving French Jews, but because it saw an opportunity to regain control over policing in France. So for Vichy, the trade-off was, we'll do the arrests if we can have control back over our policing, re-establish sovereignty. Had they not signed that Faustian pact, we simply don't know what would have happened and how effective the roundups would have been. But I think the stain on Vichy is that what it did by agreeing, and we don't know what would have happened if it hadn't agreed, I know, is that it translated a German crime into a French crime. And for me, that is Vichy's crime, in a sense. And the counterfactual can only be a counterfactual, and we simply can't know. So it's a very complicated story.
And what it makes clear is the counterfactuals are irrelevant because a crime is a crime. I mean, it's not a defense in law to say, what if you have committed a crime? And a huge crime, what we would now call actually a crime against humanity, but then it had to be framed in the context of treason. Nonetheless, it was a crime. I want to ask you a couple more questions just to finish, which is about the legacy of this trial. It's an extraordinarily interesting, complicated, it's a fascinating case in which a whole set of questions that go so far beyond the particulars of the case got raised in the courtroom. What is France? What is a crime? What is treason? The case had an afterlife. Pétain was sentenced to death. I think all the jurors believed, and the evidence that you show from the juror that you follow, they believed they weren't actually condemning him to death because of his age and other considerations too. They assumed correctly that de Gaulle would commute it to life imprisonment. He was sent to a prison on an island where he remained until his death. He became persona non grata, very difficult to visit him. Conditions were quite hard for his wife, but he wasn't executed. But over time, the myth of Pétain after the war grew in other ways. As you suggested, he had his defenders. The case was re-litigated by people writing books. His lawyer, Izorni, built a whole career, including a political career, continuing to defend Pétain, continuing to defend Vichy. So this was presumably in part because of the arguments that were made at the trial. Maybe they believed it, maybe they didn't. But it also feels like it became a vehicle for a case against de Gaulle. So how much of actually what happened to this case and its role in French history, say up to the end of the 1960s, did it morph into an argument about de Gaulle, that people used Pétain as a stick to beat de Gaulle with?
Let's say that in the 50s, after a kind of cult by the Pétain faithful was built of the old man, the oldest prisoner in the world, and there were little posters produced of him the old man looking through the bars of his prison. So this whole sort of sacrificial rhetoric was made a lot of by the Pétainist faithful, and then after he died, the sort of hardcore, he died in 1951, July 51, the hardcore Pétainists set up an association for the defense of the memory of Marshal Pétain, which still exists today. When I give talks on the book in France, there's almost always some member of that now minuscule organization who comes up and says, I don't think you've got all the full facts. Do you want the latest issue of our journal, the Maréchal? And I always politely say, yes, thank you very much, and so on. And the last one was, I gave a lecture, in fact, about a year ago now in Vichy, and in the front row was a man who had been the president of that organization, Louis de Condé, and he stood up after I'd spoken and said that as a member of the Association for the Defense of the Memory of Marshal Pétain, everybody in the audience booed. And I said, let him speak. There's no point in booing him. And he's in his 80s. He was a founding member of the Front National, it all fits and so on. And then I signed a copy of the book for him and so on. So there are these ghosts still there. But in the 50s, these ghosts were never more than a minority of fidèles. I mean, I don't know how big a minority, but we're not talking massive. But I think for the mass of the French population at that time, they wanted to believe because, in a sense, they knew that they had believed. Because there was a sense you just didn't want to think about it too much. And it was best just to think that it was all very complicated and that the de Gaulle sword, Pétain shield idea, even the idea that they'd been in cahoots, which was quite believed during the war by lots of people, was the sort of consensual best way of not having to think about it very much. So I don't think the French were thinking about it very much. And if they were, that's what they preferred to think. And opinion polls show that what, of course, they did all think was Laval was the bad one. So there was a sacrificial victim in the case of Laval. What gave quite a revival to the sort of extreme right Pétainism, which is why your point about de Gaulle is absolutely correct, was the Algerian War. And de Gaulle, of course, was hated by the extreme right for giving up Algeria, giving up, of course, the soil of France. We're back because for the Algérie Française people, Algeria was French soil. Whatever de Gaulle thought was, we need to give this up to retain the idea of France. So we get the soil. There's a lot in the defense of French Algeria about the soil of France and de Gaulle sacrificing the soil to his abstract idea and so on. So yes, so that gives a new reason to hate de Gaulle, really. And for some people, an even more profound reason to hate de Gaulle. So you get a new stratum, if you want, of anti-Gaullism, which then feeds off the Vichy one as well. So Pétainist nostalgia becomes one form of anti-Gaullism. And we're not talking about de Gaulle here today, but it's hard to imagine how hated de Gaulle was by quite a large proportion of the extreme right in France. I mean, hated to an extent which, now that he is like a sort of untouchable godlike figure, it seems impossible for us to believe. So when he stood for re-election as president in 1965, the first time that there was a presidential election by universal suffrage, Fifth Republic, one of his opponents was a man called Tixier-Vignancourt, who was a brilliant lawyer in the Isorni mould, who had played a very small role in the Vichy regime. He was very young and had then defended some of the extreme right defenders of Algérie Française. He was a bit the Isorni of Algérie Française, if you want. And so he stood against de Gaulle. And one of his main communications advisor was Jean-Marie Le Pen, who of course went on to be. So there is, there's a whole, as it were, thread or strands there in which anti-Gaullism and Pétainist nostalgia are inextricably mixed. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
So then my last question, which picks up on that. So in a sense, from the 60s on, one could say two things happen. One is the rise of the far right, and then the far right, and I want to ask you where we are today with this, into a form of at least democratic plausibility, and possibly, we may be on the cusp of France being about to have a far-right government in some form or another. At the same time, the story that we were talking about before, hard for us to reconstruct just how little understanding or even interest there was in the story of what happened to France's Jews. That clearly changed. It changed from the 1970s onwards. Historical work, including by an American, Robert Paxton, which showed not only that the fate of France's Jews was in many ways worse than people believed, but the extent of complicity across French society was much greater. So that reckoning had to begin in the 1970s. So one effect of that reckoning, I assume, was to marginalize Pétain's case, because there were other cases to be tried. There were trials, and there were trials of the people who were the killers responsible. And in a sense, what happened in 1945 becomes not ancient history, but it becomes a historical event in the context of a very different set of arguments about bringing to justice those who were complicit in genocide, which is a term by that point that everybody would have been familiar with. So in that sense, Pétain moves to the margins of the central argument. But on the other side, the rise of the far right means that Pétain, in a different sense, moves back into arguments in French politics, and particularly a person that you mentioned earlier, Éric Zemmour, who for a while seemed to offer a rival version of far-right politics to Marine Le Pen, and who was a Pétainist, am I right? I mean, he was a defender of Marshal Pétain. Where does that argument stand now? So in the politics of the right, the far right, if we want to call it that, I don't know if that term is still appropriate anymore. As Pétain moved to the margins of those other arguments about collaboration and complicity, and his case becomes a historical event, does he still play a part in 2025 in the politics of the far right in France? Does he, for instance, play any part in the politics of Marine Le Pen?
So your overview chronology of the shifting historiography and memory is absolutely correct. The sort of revolution comes from the book, the Robert Paxton, who I think there's no example of a historian of a country who's completely changed the way that that country sees itself than that extraordinary book that, a young American professor wrote in 1973, which still remains, a Bible. It's still the book. And what he showed was he began the process of unpicking all the defenses that the trial had offered, and basically that the French had sought collaboration, and if there wasn't more collaboration, it wasn't because the French didn't want it, because the Germans weren't ready to offer it, that Vichy had had its own independent anti-Semitic policies, etc., etc.
And he cast the net so much wider than the case of Pétain himself.
Absolutely, yes. And anti-Semitism becomes central. He goes on to write a book about Vichy France and the Jews with another historian. And then, in a sense, that historiographical revolution, which is already becoming more than just a historiographical one, it starts to seep into, as it were, popular memory, is kind of consolidated when Jacques Chirac, who was president, almost his first act on becoming president in 1995, was to make a speech on the anniversary of the roundups of Jews in July 1942, on the anniversary of the famous Rafle du Vel d'Hiver, the roundup of the sports stadium, which is where the Jews were parked before being sent off to concentration camps. He made a speech which said that France committed that day an irreparable act. Now that doesn't sound it doesn't sound so dramatic, but what that did was actually puncture the Gaullist myth of the past, because de Gaulle never talked much about as we've said when talking about the Jews earlier, like everybody, that was seen as a German crime, and for de Gaulle doubly so, because if Vichy never existed, if Vichy wasn't a proper regime, it wasn't France, it was a puppet. So for Chirac, using the words France committed an irreparable act is a fantastically important moment in public discourse, and it's one that essentially nobody has repudiated. In fact, every French president since has more or less found an occasion to repeat that speech, and sometimes actually push it so far that it becomes ahistorical, because in the last Macron version of that speech on the same anniversary, it's almost as if the Germans had nothing to do with it at all. So one has to, if you want to be properly historical, Vichy is complicit, but there are the Germans. Anyway, so Vichy's complicity in a crime against humanity is now pretty universally accepted in France today. So how does that affect the way you can mobilize the memory of Vichy? Well, the answer is, I think you can't, which is why I ended my book in the English version with the sentence, "The Pétain case is now closed." And various reviewers said they weren't really sure this was quite right. Is it closed? Are there still debates going on? And so I changed the French translation because people had misunderstood what I meant to say. What I meant to say was that the positioning of Zemmour and Le Pen was very interesting. Le Pen père, the father of Marine Le Pen, was an unashamed apologist for Vichy. He was openly anti-Semitic. One of his most infamous little quips, really, was that the Holocaust was just a detail of history, and there were lots of bad taste jokes about the fate of the Jews and so on. Marine Le Pen, once she took over the party, set about whatever she thinks, and I have no idea what she thinks actually, to detoxify, as she put it, the party, to clean up its image. And the main instrument of detoxification was to resist any Vichyite nostalgia. So Le Pen père used to go from time, well, not every year, but he used to go and pay his respects to the tomb of Marshal Pétain on the Île Dieu, that little island where he was incarcerated. Marine Le Pen goes now to the grave of de Gaulle at Colombille des Églises. So she's making it absolutely clear, I will have no truck with that. So what was very interesting was in the last presidential election, a more extreme far-right candidate appeared in the version of Éric Zemmour, himself ironically Jewish, of pied noir, of French-Algerian origin, though he was actually born in France. So Zemmour, obviously, to some extent, he was able to say things as a Jew that he's covered to some extent by that. So Zemmour brought out the old argument about Vichy saving the Jews, saving French Jews. He repeated it on many occasions. And I think he was doing it strategically, because what I think he was trying to do, I think he's trying to do two things. One was the one thing in French consciousness today that makes Vichy unacceptable is what happened in July 1942, the deportations. So if you can, as it were, rescue the deportations or separate Vichy from them, you can begin a process of rehabilitation. Now, why does he want to do that? I think he wants to do that because he is seeking, his strategy has been a union of the right, the extreme right and the, whatever you want to call it, because you're quite right to say, where is the extreme right today? Where's extreme? But let's say the parliamentary right, the old Gaullists, as it were. That if you can, as it were, save Vichy from the one thing that everybody agrees is the crime of Vichy, you can pave the way towards a union of the old extreme right and the right. I think his other idea is that essentially Zemmour's extreme anti-Muslim rhetoric, not just against immigrants, but against French Maghrebi citizens of sometimes, second generation, he does, I think, envisage something on the lines, if you want, of the Vichy Jewish statute, exclusion, some kinds of exclusionary policies. But you've got to first rehabilitate Vichy and then say that bit of Vichy is acceptable. The bit that isn't acceptable is the roundups, but that wasn't Vichy, or Vichy did its best to save the Jews. So I think he is thinking strategically. But what is interesting is that when it came to the election, Zemmour bombed. All right, he didn't get nothing. He got 7% in the first round. That's not nothing. That's 1.5 million votes. But it's the extreme, And Le Pen's strategy of distancing obviously worked better than Zemmour's strategy or tactic of attempting to rehabilitate Vichy. So when I said the Pétain case is closed, what I meant was it's no longer operative for political instrumentalization today. And so the way I ended the French version was to say the Pétain case is now closed, but Pétainism in the form of exclusionary nationalism, etc., anti-Europeanism, inward-looking, narrow, exclusionary nationalism, is alive and well. But it's not by invoking the name of Pétain that you will serve the values of Pétainism, because obviously it's a bit crude to say that the Front National is Pétainist, but I think that some of those extreme right, there's a filiation, there's a lineage, but the way to make it work is simply not by invoking the memory of Pétain.
As I mentioned at the start of the first of these two episodes, we did get a lot of requests to talk about this trial, in particular to talk to Julian Jackson, and I'm very grateful to him for agreeing to these two conversations. I do enormously recommend his book, France on Trial. We are very grateful for all of the communications, requests, questions that we get. We get so many, and we are a very small team. We don't get the chance to reply to them all, but we do, I promise you, read them all and value them. So do keep them coming in. Many of the suggestions do end up as episodes on PPF. We're going to take another break from Politics on Trial, though we will be coming back. Lots more trials to come. Eichmann in Jerusalem, Mandela, the Lady Chatterley's lover trial is coming up. But before we return to Politics on Trial, we've got a few, I hope, very interesting standalone episodes and pairs of episodes coming up. Starting next time with a pair of episodes in which I'm speaking to the historian Chris Clark, who's appeared quite a few times before on PPF to talk about episodes in German history. And we're going to be talking more about German history, but in a very particular way. We're going to be talking about the figures from German history who can be used to make sense of Donald Trump. Who are the Trump-like leaders from modern German history? And I'm just going to give you one clue. It's not the one that you think. To find out more, join us next time. This has been Past, Present, Future.